So good afternoon, everyone. I'm Rod Howe, supervisor for the town of Ithaca. And this is very exciting to be talking to city and town officials about community choice aggregation or Tompkins Green Energy Network. We wanted to start with town officials and city officials to start answering questions that you might have. We're going to go through a presentation and then certainly leave time for Q&A. Some of us have been talking about CCA for quite a long time, maybe 3 years. It's been a while. And we're excited that we have branded it specific to Tompkins County with Tompkins Green Energy Network. We're Ithaca, we're Tompkins County. We like to be innovative. And so certainly the approach that we're taking to CCA has an innovative approach, and that's probably what you're going to learn about today. Both the city and the town approved the enabling legislation to move in this direction last summer. There are other municipalities in Tompkins County that we have been working with and are interested and hopefully will join, once this is approved next spring or whatever. So we will be sharing, we will be putting this on YouTube. We'll be sharing this link with our municipal sisters so that they can see that. We will certainly be doing additional education and outreach. We're required to do that and we want to do that, but we wanted to start with the policymakers who are going to be approving this hopefully in September. And we've also invited our CCE colleagues who might help us with education and outreach along the way. Gay Nicholson with Sustainable Finger Lakes is also here. She's been very instrumental the past few years. We did get a grant from the Park Foundation that allowed us to work with local power to get us to this point. So we want to thank and acknowledge Park Foundation. So today's goal is really to start giving you, I know some of you have been hearing about CCA TGen along the way, but this is sort of a practice session for us to see how do we start conveying the information in a meaningful way, because the general public is going to have to understand this. We're both the city and the town will be doing public meetings about this. So we want to do some of the education and outreach in advance of those public meetings. I think that's, oh, by the way, there is going to be a video, but it wasn't ready for today. So soon for the general public, we'll be able to start sharing a video to kind of help getting the word out. What is TGen? We've been, we're almost ready to launch that. And I'm going to turn over to Rich just for a couple of minutes. And Rich, I don't know if you want to mention someone who was very helpful in coming up with the logo.
Yeah. We worked with Mickey Quinn, who some of you might know. She's an events promoter and coordinator around town, and she was kind enough to barter with me for audio services, so we did a little graphics work there. I also wanted to mention, while I had the floor, for those of you who may or may not be concerned about quorum issues in the open meetings law and so forth, it doesn't look like we have a quorum of any legislative entity at the moment, but I think the idea is that this is an information session, and people are free to ask questions specific to the initiative without deliberating about potential approvals and so on and so forth. So as long as we steer clear from getting into the sort of legislative components, we're good to go according to our respective council.
So the broader team, is there anything else you think we need to mention that's not going to be covered in the slideshow to help set the stage?
I guess we're just really presenting on the DER plan, the Distributed Energy Resource Plan today. So there will be more information coming about the more holistic plan that includes procurement and selection of an energy service provider and all that sort of stuff. We'll dig into a little bit today, but aren't going to go into the details of that. This is really focusing on the distributed energy portion.
And that's a good point, that when we do the more public sessions, we'll have to go back and we have lots of slideshows to draw from. What is CCA? So anyways, that's a good point. Thank you, Rebecca. So we'll be focused a bit tonight on what both the city and the town will actually be voting on probably in September at some point. So with that, we will turn it over to, and Rebecca, do you, I think everyone knows who Rebecca is, but if you want to introduce yourself, and Paul will have you introduce yourself as well. So Rebecca, I think you're starting first, is that correct?
Yeah, Paul and I can both introduce ourselves at least briefly at first, and then Paul has a more in-depth introduction slide about himself and local power. I'm Rebecca Evans. I'm the Director of Sustainability for the City of Ithaca. I've been with the city for about a little over 2 years now. Paul, do you want to introduce yourself?
Oh, yes, certainly. Hi, I'm Paul Fenn from Local Power. I've been working on CCA for about 30 years and glad to be working with the city and town.
Great. So my apologies in advance to members of PEDC, because you will have seen at least a portion of this already, but maybe it'll be a nice reminder. So we're going to use the term CCA, Community Choice Aggregation, and the acronym TGen, Tompkins Green Energy Network, interchangeably. They're the same thing. TGen is just the name of our local program, but more generally, it is a CCA program. So just a quick reminder of what is CCA. It basically empowers municipalities to purchase energy on behalf of their residents. It also maintains that the utility still controls the distribution and transmission infrastructure. So we're not going to be buying any of that. We are just basically choosing who we're getting energy from and purchasing it in bulk. So just sort of where we are in the timeline, about a year ago, we entered into a contract with Local Power LLC, who is our CCA consultant. And there has been a number of changes throughout the year at the state level that determines the process through which new and existing CCA programs are approved by the state. So we had to wait several months to get guidance from the state, but now that we have that guidance, we have officially received this DER plan, and just last week it was approved by the Planning and Economic Development Committee to send on to council with the city. And as Rod mentioned, it'll go to the town next month, it sounds like, for a vote. We will then have to select a CCA administrator, which is a lot of that work is done at the state level. So we just need to essentially choose a master implementation plan that jives with the program that we're envisioning. And once we've done that, then we can get into the sort of the real meaty work of selecting an energy service provider, starting to do that public outreach, and ultimately starting to enroll customers. So we're still almost a year out from officially enrolling customers, which we're aiming for June 2024. So why are we doing this? How does this ultimately help us achieve our collective Green New Deal goals? So if we look at this is a representation of the city's greenhouse gas emissions, but really what we're targeting is that 14% down in the lower left-hand corner, the electric grid decarbonization. So yes, we are planning to purchase renewable electricity, but we're also concerned about the heat loss from transmission, and I'll go into that in just a second. But before we do that, I just want to be really, really clear. I know I've gotten a number of communications from residents that are kind of confused as to what this program will and won't do. So I want to be really explicit about that. It will purchase electricity and gas on behalf of residents and businesses. It will provide pathways for renewable energy investment, which is exactly what we're talking about today. It'll also provide pathways for the development of microgrids, and we'll go into what that means in a little bit. It also eliminates Scope 2 emissions, which when you report your greenhouse gas emissions, there are 3 scopes, and Scope 2 just means everything to do with electricity. And for the city, that's right at around 50,000 metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. This process will also provide transparency in the renewables market that is otherwise unachievable by purchasing renewable energy certificates. So there are a number of, 1, transparency issues, but 2, equity and environmental justice issues that come up with the purchasing of RECs. And then again, very explicitly what it will not do. It's not going to replace transmission or distribution infrastructure. So we are not intending to go out and buy the electrical lines that run around the streets. It's not going to eliminate the delivery rate increases that are a result of the NYSEG rate case that you probably have heard about in the last couple of months. That is on the delivery side, and residents will still receive a bill for NYSEG delivery. And just to be extra clear, this is not going to replace NYSEG. We will still be reliant on them in some capacity. So I mentioned that 14% of emissions. So when you are, when you say plug your phone into an outlet in the wall, you're not actually receiving all of the energy that it took to actually charge that phone. So you're really only receiving about a third of the energy that was produced in order to actually get that electricity to you. So you lose about almost 2/3 through the conversion process. The actual running of the power plant is another 6%. And then you lose another about 10% through transmission and distribution losses. And so a good example when you think about this is you think about traditional incandescent light bulbs. They get really, really hot if you turn them on for a long time. The reason for that is a lot of the heat that they produce, or a lot of the light that they produce, that energy is lost to heat. So LEDs, which are much more efficient, don't get as hot. So it's the exact same idea when we're talking about transmission and distribution infrastructure. And that's something that cannot be avoided without the deployment of microgrids, basically creating our own little tiny grids. And like I said, we'll go into the details of what that means in just a second. So this plan, this DER plan, is the only way that we can avoid those emissions. So Paul's going to go into this a little bit deeper, but the whole purpose of this particular plan is to give customers the option to collectively or individually invest in distributed energy resources. And that is accessible through a loan that is available to anybody, and that is approved by the CCA administrator. And when we start to actually collectively invest, then we can actually achieve economies of scale and further financial savings. So the process through which this happens, the administrator is going to engage with local financial institutions to start setting up potential loans for customers that are interested in voluntarily investing. The lenders are then responsible for providing the administrator with data for tracking whatever the system is that they're investing in, and ensuring that and sharing the data associated with customer return on investment. Those DER systems are designed based on the priorities of a customer or a cooperative. So essentially, a customer would have a menu of choices to invest in, and those will be predetermined, although I think there will be some flexibility there. And a customer or a cooperative of customers can then choose, this is the technology that we're most interested in, that we want to collectively invest in. The city and the town will then ultimately have final oversight over the legal agreements that are signed between investors, site owners, and users. And again, we'll go into exactly what those terms mean, but basically anyone that is involved within the process of investment will need to have a legal agreement to ensure that dividends that are received are meeting expectations and people are getting ultimately what they thought they were investing in. The administrator then manages procurement on behalf of the customers. So the administrator is going to create relationships with DER developers, like a solar developer or geothermal developer, what have you, so that a customer doesn't have to do that themselves, or a collective does not have to do that themselves. And then the cooperative members, the residents that have invested in this technology, will receive a monthly dividend based on what was ironed out in those legal agreements in step 4. So just to clarify sort of what these relationships really look like, on the left side of the screen, or at least my left, you have basic service. So this is just if CCA was providing energy service and not the DER portion. So you have the city and the town of Ithaca at the top, sort of acting as the oversight to this entire program. They employ a CCA administrator who then has a relationship with an energy service provider and provides electricity and natural gas service to the customers. when we add this extra fold of the DER investment, we're adding an entire other arm to this relationship matrix. So we still have the municipalities maintaining oversight of the program. The CCA administrator is still maintaining sort of the everyday goings on of the program, still dealing with the energy service provider, but then we're also able to create customer cooperatives. So it's not just an individual customer, you can have a group of customers, and the CCA administrators managing the relationships between project developers and financial institutions on behalf of customers. So why would this be ultimately valuable to customers, to residents and businesses here locally? Ultimately, the big selling point is that we're getting a net greenhouse gas emissions reduction through that. In the case of the city of Ithaca, 14% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. We're also seeing financial savings, both through reduced energy costs and through those monthly dividends if residents choose to invest. We're also getting on-site renewables, resiliency in the event of a blackout, and I'll go into that, what that really means in just a second. The fact that we are using local financial institutions for these loans also keeps wealth local. It provides economic opportunities through the building of new projects, new opportunities for active participation. For example, a lot of questions that we get in the sustainability offices are, where can I plug in? How can I participate? And this is a very clear way for individual residents to participate in our sustainability programs. It also is universally accessible. So traditionally with renewable energy systems, they're only accessible to very wealthy households. This actually removes the need for a credit threshold in order to participate, so that anybody is able to participate in this program, and renters who do not own their properties are also able to invest in renewable energy systems. And in a town where we have 75% renters, that's extremely, extremely valuable. It also, through traditional means, these are usually national searches to find developers to actually build projects, but we intend to try and keep this as local as possible. So we have a specific program for an outreach for local developers and installers. And it also opens up the doors to resources on public property. So why is this valuable to the city and the town? Like I said, this was given to PEDC last week, which is why you keep seeing the city and not the town all over this. So my apologies for that. Let's take a look at what this actually looks like traditionally versus what it would look like under a DER program. So this is what we're functioning under now. There's a single building that's connected to the big national grid, which is ultimately in our region managed by NYSEG. During a blackout, as we all know, the big grid goes down and nobody has any power. But buildings that have their own microgrid, which I mentioned before, can ultimately island off, which essentially, if you think about it as a light switch, the power goes out and everyone has no lights, no heat, no air conditioning, nothing. But in a building that's connected to a microgrid, you can flip a switch that basically turns on your microgrid and allows you to have access to power, even if your neighbors do not, which allows the building to temporarily power itself. You can also have microgrids that are within a larger grid, so you can connect multiple buildings to each other or to the same microgrid, and still have access to the services that are provided by the utility, which is what we're talking about today. Those microgrids can also store excess energy, just like a battery. So when the power goes out and the sun isn't shining or the wind isn't blowing, what have you, it can still provide energy to a neighborhood, much like a traditional power plant. And this came up in a previous meeting at PEDC, sort of the issues of congestion. When you start to deploy a bunch of renewables all at once, you can get a lot of congestion. If you think about electrical lines as like a traffic on a street, they were really built for one-way traffic. But when you start to add renewables, now you're adding another lane of traffic going the opposite direction, but you haven't changed the infrastructure at all. You haven't added additional lines onto the road telling people where to go. So you end up with a whole bunch of traffic jams. When you have a microgrid, you can actually prepare it to balance out those fluctuations in grid voltage and frequency so that you can avoid that congestion altogether. And this is just a fun visual. And that's all for me. So I'm going to pass it on to Paul, our CCA consultant.
Paul, you're on mute.
Thank you. Thank you, Rebecca. Yeah, so I'm just going to provide a little more detail on some of these points. You know, the emphasis here is microgrids, nanogrids. You know, microgrids are larger multiple building networks connecting customers and solar panels and loads. Nanogrids are smaller networks that don't require as much integration, often within one building between different meters. Thermal loops are small heat sharing or hot water sharing groups. Districts are obviously larger. EV shares are electric vehicle shares, and then waste sequestration, reuse, and decarbonization really concerns the sequestration and separation and reuse of waste to decarbonize waste, which is a significant source of methane and greenhouse gas emissions. So it's just a long title there, but in some ways, this sums up the technological paradigm of the program, which is, you know, connective processes that involve more than one isolated consumer to take advantage of some of the economic opportunities that come with sharing and some of the technologies that have emerged in the last decade or two that make sharing easy to do, provided organization. Next slide, please, Rebecca. First, I'll just give a little background for myself and for my company. This program is really the culmination of our work with community choice aggregators around the country for the last 30 years. It was really developed for New York, this program design, after having developed on the right side there, the original municipal aggregation bill, which came to be known as CCA 1.0, and that was just buying power and renewable energy certificates as a community in order to get legally greener power cheaper. Then that was in the mid 90s, and then in 2013 we came up with actually we completed and started launching a second model in California known as CCA 2.0, and this was a model designed to enable CCAs to build renewable energy and not just to buy power and certificates from third parties, but to actually build new renewable energy. It was quite a leap to get that to happen. That included the writing of a new kind of CCA law, intervening with the state regulator for 2 years, and then working with the California Energy Commission and 2 counties to design the programs. We partnered with Los Alamos National Laboratory and then implemented for 6 or 7 years CCA programs across California, particularly in the Bay Area, which kind of started the whole thing in California. That had a big splash there. It's resulted in, I think, over $30 billion of local renewable energy investment by the CCAs. But what we kind of the takeaway from that was, from a carbon point of view, for communities like the city and town of Ithaca that aren't just concerned with green power per se, but are actually looking for carbon reductions and realizing carbon reduction goals, that it wasn't enough. So we started working on New York with this in mind. We'd also, as you can see on the top, that worked in other states. But in 2014, wrote a CCA bill for New York. The governor then ordered CCA, and the Public Service Commission wrote the regulations for it. So we intervened in that process. We then hired by NYSERDA to help them develop the CCA toolkit for municipalities. And then we're appointed to the DPS CCA subgroup of the Voluntary Investment Working Group. And that was specifically focused on what to do about barriers to distributed energy resource development by CCAs in the New York system. Because the DPS was aware that there are barriers in the New York system that don't exist in California. And there are a lot of details around that, but in a nutshell, there needed to be a new model that could work in the New York system within the constraints that that authorize CCA. So we got a grant and partnered with 11 cities, including Saratoga Springs, New York, with the Urban Sustainability Directors Network, and wrote the CCA 3.0 plan or business model in 2020. And that really was kind of how we got really going with Ithaca, and hired as a consultant there. And so we've been working on it since then. But it's the idea is to deliver a CCA that can, like California did, the leap from just buying certificates to building wind farms, solar farms, geothermal farms, which they're doing, to a higher level of carbon reduction than just renewable power plants. And so that's what got us here. So please, next slide, Rebecca. So a really important part of the leap is realizing that carbon isn't just about electricity, that power, heat, transportation, and waste represent the full spectrum of addressable carbon for municipalities as identified by the United Nations, that these are the carbon sources that communities can address. And so we wanted to bring them all into the purview of the policy so that you would have the biggest possible climate impact in your program, and not just be limited to the power slice officially, which is maybe, a quarter of your emissions technically. So if you aren't dealing with heat, then you're missing out on 20% or something. I don't know what it is locally. Transport, another 20-25%. Waste being a significant fourth on that list. So addressable carbon, 4 types of DER are needed to have a really robust climate strategy with the CCA. And then 7 kinds of energy users, right? The typical CCA in New York really just has residential customers and small commercial customers. Many of them exclude subsidized participants, like the assistance program participants, low income LMI customers that qualify for subsidized utility bills. They're often excluded. And so you lose a huge part of the population, and therefore a huge significant part of the carbon. Many of them exclude their government energy procurement. Governments are often among the largest energy users in their communities, depending on the community. Educational institutions, large commercial institutions, specifically municipal institutions, medical. These are major uses. I mean, there are some CCAs like San Francisco. We worked there for 10 years in setting up their program, where 50 buildings in downtown San Francisco consumed half of the energy in the city. So if they weren't included, then where's the carbon? You're missing out on this huge slice. So to get carbon, you need an all addressable carbon, all 4 sources, and a full range of customer types that are included. So this program does that. Next slide, please, Rebecca. So yeah, this is just a visual on that argument that if you have just electricity, you're only going to get so far in your carbon reductions. If you add heating or gas, so that you're able to electrify gas and then to repower the electricity sources with renewables, then you get a big leap on your carbon emissions. If you add transportation with electric vehicles, then all the more. And if you add waste decarbonization, then you get the full, you're really getting what you can get out of this program. Next slide. And so, yeah, the same that with the customer types, that residential is, most of the users are residential, but a small fraction of the energy of the electricity consumption anyway is residential in most communities. So if you add small commercial, those are the so-called opt-out enrollment eligible customers in New York. Then you're getting quite a bit, but you're missing out on a lot. If you add municipalities, governments, institutions, then it's getting more robust. If you add everybody and you just say, okay, whether you're opt-out enrolled or opt-in enrolled, you're eligible, and we're going to offer service to you, and we're going to solicit your participation, then you get the full impact in terms of participating load, or at least the potential impact from participating load. Next slide. So yeah, I mean, the way to do it is universal eligibility, all carbon, and the CCA is intended to throw the net wide, and so that everyone has the opportunity to participate in this program, and then to include technology types across all addressable carbon in order to achieve the 2030 goal of the city and town. Next slide. So it's complex, but it is actually necessary. The core strategy of the program is to more rapidly switch people over to decarbonized power, heat vehicles, and waste that otherwise can be delivered at a community scale. And currently, up until now, most programs, CCA programs even, but also renewable energy incentive programs, energy efficiency incentive programs, just can't deliver the goals that the city and town have adopted. They just don't have a sufficient amount of leverage, and if you want to call it purchase on the causes of carbon in the community to do that. It takes a lot to decarbonize an entire community. It can't just be done based upon a piecemeal approach, or based upon approaches that have that concede exclusions or niching out of the different customer types and the different carbon types, where they're all separately decided and separately sourced. That piecemeal approach leads to the kind of very slow progress that we've seen in the country and around the world in the past 25 years. That we need something more robust. We need an umbrella that connects the dots between technologies. The opportunity technologically is so-called technology convergence, that today, in the past really 15 years, but increasingly, the electricity, heating, transportation, and waste technologies are converging into essentially to a common electrical system. So an electric vehicle is a battery. Electric vehicles that are configured properly can power buildings. That's new. You couldn't do that before. And being able to do that, and also being able to put controls on a building that decides whether or not it uses the grid or uses a solar panel or other resources on a nanogrid or a microgrid, these are all now happening. And so they're no longer futuristic technologies. They're now in the market. The vehicles are in the market with bidirectional chargers. The hybrid inverters are in the market that allow software control, the grid connection. Heating systems and cooling systems essentially have become forms of energy storage. And these facilitate a new level of energy transition that just wasn't possible before. And so we have this program is very much focused on taking advantage of these technologies and creating a matching program structure to support their development in the community. So it's not simple, but the reason it's not simple is that a community-wide energy transition is a major initiative. It's inherently complex. If it's going to succeed, it has to be robust and it has to involve a degree of complexity. So the complexity is on the program design side. It's on the if you want to call it the soft side of the program. Energy transitions all over the world are challenged by these facts, right? That's why carbon goals have not been met. That's why climate action is in many ways stalled out around the world. And so, you know, this program is intended to provide that robust platform to enable community-wide decarbonization as an answer to the call of the United Nations Secretary General regarding energy transitions by 2030, to have energy transitions accomplished by that date that can serve as examples to the world for replication. And so this is an answer that based on a largely proven model, widely successful, 2,000 cities across the country that are CCAs in half of the US energy market. And with the 2.0 model proven in California, hugely successful in developing renewables. This is a third iteration that says, okay, let's really put the pedal to the metal on what CCA can do, provided an adequate program structure to support it. So next slide, please.
And Paul, just to note, it's almost 4:40. I think, I don't know how many more slides you have.
I think it's just a few more.
Okay.
A few more. So it's a robust engagement, outreach, and education process to sign up share buyers, users, and site owners. And I'll just to explain that, share buyers are people who buy shares in a DER. So strictly financial participation, where the dividends from the generation of power on an asset go to the investors, and to localize that process to residents and businesses inside of the CCA. Users are people who are going to use the energy that's generated by these systems, and they also will be shared buyers, but they won't only be participating financially, they'll also be physically taking their power, their heat, their transportation from the DERs physically. So that's the robust engagement will be connecting these people with site owners, whose obviously permission will be required to develop assets like this, and therefore to have a site acquisition process as opposed to just a marketing process, which is the usual approach to green power, just having advertisements and waiting for people to sign up. We're taking an acquisition approach to this instead, more like the way that a cell network is built out. It's based upon putting technologies where they fit, and soliciting participation of building owners and users on those locations. So there's more engineering involved. So we're going to have support from the city and town to provide ongoing communications, identifying the program to the public. So we're trying to project a different idea here, because a key part of the opportunity is to help people recognize, in a market that's very kind of in a way, energy markets are very opaque, and they are very saturated with bad information, right? So we need to penetrate this bad information. What I mean by bad information is false marketing, which there's a great deal in the energy sector, and predatory activities that take advantage of people. So the need to convey to the community, this is more like recycling bins. It's a community initiative. It's not just a product. It's about people participating in a community-wide energy transition. Its purposes are public in nature. And rather than just being essentially a product that's owned by a non-local financier, which is almost the entire renewable energy industry, because it's all obviously funded by the investment tax credit. And so it's concentrated capital that's financing most renewable energy. This is looking to localize the finance to enable the energy user to become the owner. So an authentic investment vehicle for residents and businesses to receive the benefits of ownership, as opposed to paying a premium for a product whose economic benefits go to someone who's not local and is usually not identified. So to make the user into the economic beneficiary, and the local power, I should say here, pardon me, the CCA administrator in our current role now is as a consultant, but whoever the CCA administrator will act as a procurement agent for the customer in designing and soliciting proposals for DER projects. So in other words, to help consumers to evaluate options without having to become experts in these technologies, because it is difficult to choose the technologies and to understand which ones make sense for like your home or your business, your circumstances, to help people adapt technologies to their circumstances and then help them evaluate proposals from distributed energy resource providers. The next slide, please. So yeah, the purpose here is to go to scale. And right now it's only the few really who can participate in most of these technologies. And we need it to be normalized in order to get greenhouse gas impacts that meet 2030 goals. Next slide. And here's just a simple illustration of the idea in terms of, how would people cooperate. These are for single family homes as opposed to, denser urban core. But, some homes are good platforms for photovoltaic panels. Some are not. Some of them have ready parking, others don't. So different circumstances provides a pathway for cooperation, right? And so to help people share resources like a geothermal loop, like a solar panel, or hydrogen, or an electric vehicle on a network, to make their energy, to lower the cost of the systems, to lower the capital burden, which is really one of the main barriers to advanced distributed energy resources, to lower those capital burdens through co-investment into larger, more integrated systems. That's the core kind of technology strategy here. Next slide. So in terms of the administrator, roles and responsibilities, they include procurement of electricity, of natural gas, and DER for customers, to ensure compliance with state regulations, to facilitate neighborhood level co-investment by customers in these projects, and then to manage the bookkeeping for the co-investors, to track the performance of systems that are installed, maintain the data, keep it current, and provide annual reports to the customer, to the municipality, and to the Public Service Commission. I think that is the end. Oh no, there's one more. It's a summary, really, that just going up to high level again, how do you achieve it, the 2030 transition? What are the key kind of levers that you need to get that huge of an impact in such a short period of time? You need to include technologies that replace all addressable carbon types by the United Nations definition. You need to offer universal eligibility for investment. You need to include municipal electricity and gas accounts, include both opt-out eligible, those are the small commercial and residential customers, and then also include all opt-in eligible electricity and gas accounts. Those are the large commercial and institutions, universities, and then to provide trusted third-party support to facilitate record keeping and track DER performance, so that there's effectively a safe zone, a reliable source of information, so that consumers feel comfortable making these types of decisions. I believe that is the end. Yes.
Great. Thank you both, Paul and Rebecca. You know, again, just to underscore something Rebecca said at the beginning, we thought it was important to go through this with local, town, and city officials because presumably both will be potentially voting on this in September, the distributed energy resource plan. But certainly when we do the education and outreach for the general public, we'll have to go back and just do some table setting again about CCA. What is CCA? Why should I be interested? So these are sort of paired present. You can think of them as paired presentations. I think the general public will be more interested in the CCA, the more general CCA part, because not everyone's going to jump into being part of a DER initiative right away, although we would like to be encouraging that as we move forward. So this is really an opportunity for anyone to ask questions. If there's something, we can go back to a slide if you want us to go back to a slide, but we're just opening it up. And if I don't see your hand, just unmute and say, hey, I'm trying to ask a question, but who would like to start? Bye, Laura. Thank you for joining us. And some of us have been looking at this a long time and we still have questions. So know that we know it's not something you absorb in one or two presentations. Rich, I think you can agree to that, right? Sometimes it's
Yeah, I mean, I'll start the bidding by asking Paul to maybe reflect a little bit on the area of questions that I had most persistently along the way related to investment, equity, dividends, etc. Can you delineate, for example, between, say, a sort of investor and a user? How does the investor derive a financial benefit? What happens if someone is participating in a DER as an investor or user, and then elects to, they move out of town or they're no longer participating? What happens to their equity, or is the equity only in the form of cost savings, et cetera, et cetera? Can you just break that down a little bit? Because I know there's going to be some question about that.
Yeah, no, it's a good question. Or a good series of questions, and there's a lot to talk about there. The protocol that we've set up in the local DR plan is iterative. Because this approach is designed to facilitate co-investment by neighbors. And so in the current market, this is entirely voluntary activity, right? It's anyone can do this theoretically. Nothing stops anyone from co-investing in solar panels, and people do that. There are community solar projects, and there are vehicle shares, and there's nothing inherently new or regulated about the activity. People are free to co-invest in the way that they wish to co-invest with each other. And so between a site owner, a user, and a share buyer, these are, the users are in the building, the site owner owns the building, the sharers are the users and neighbors who are not users. When I say neighbors, I mean in the same neighborhood. So not just in the same city, but in the same neighborhood. And so because we have 4 categories of DERs: power, heat, transportation, and waste, there's going to be a great diversity of projects in terms of the technologies that are involved. And because we're offering eligibility to all customers, there's going to be a great diversity of forms of cooperation between people, right? Whether it's low income, renters, public housing, owners, condominiums, co-ops, you have all these different types of, they have different kinds of co-investment that will correspond to that. So what we did in the local DR plan was to set up a protocol to create templates for agreements between different types as they emerge, because it is iterative. We have to to sign people up that want to basically lead. And the idea here is to use leadership in the community to drive the process. One of the takeaways that we had from CCA 2.0 was that this is lacking. There needed to be something for the activists to do, people that want to lead. And so the leaders then can through the enrollment process, we'll work with them to develop template agreements with the early groups that form, and then bring those back to the CCA advisory group for review and sign off. And this pretty much matches the Public Service Commission protocol for approval of CCA supply documents. So it's like a little version of the PSC approval process. At the DR level, recognizing though that those agreements are consensual, they're not regulated. And so we believe and we agreed that the municipality should have some oversight, even though it's not required, just so that there is a coherent process, and so that it sets a good example for others that may follow in implementing this kind of a model. So it isn't just some a broker with a black box and no one knows how it works, and they use whatever agreements they want and can take advantage of people, but instead to have some process around that for review and sign off before the templates are approved. But then once the template's approved, it can be reused. Ultimately, we'll end up having a bunch of different templates reflecting the different types of groups, different kinds of technologies, but those will take some time to develop, and we didn't want to sort of over-determine or over-design a priori how that's going to work, recognizing that diversity is a very important part of universal service, universal access, that you really don't get universal access if you over-determine how those agreements are going to work.
Yeah, so thank you for that clarification. I just wanted to ask one clarifying question. So these projects, they're all going to take shape in different ways. They're all going to have different values based on the investment that is needed in order to get them up and running. There will be a finite number of shares available, am I to presume? The investor base can't be infinite, right? It just is, there's a...
Yeah.
So
yeah. It'll be based entirely on the size of the project, the number of participants. So if you're in a, if you're in a multi-unit residential building or a mixed-use, high-density urban area in downtown city of Ithaca, then you might have hundreds of people, right, that are in a co-op. The users in the building, and then the neighbors. If you're in a small edge of town of Ithaca, single-family homes, it could be, 7 people, 2 houses that are connected. And so the users, the site owner and the users are the first steps of decision-making for enrollments and for specifying the size of the facility and with the technology components to physically serve the buildings that are involved, right? So it's essentially scaled to the buildings, appropriate technology kind of approach. And then once that has occurred, and that's the key challenge, right? To enroll people in investment decisions is a harder part of it, who are actually going to use the system. That's the hard part. The easy part is enrolling investors, because it's essentially a financial decision. It is strictly on paper, does not require real cooperation like you need between people that are going to share an electric vehicle, right? 2 people are going to share an electric vehicle. They have to decide how it is we're going to share this car, right? Or if it's a heating system, or if it's a solar panel on a microgrid. That's a serious relationship that takes some parsing and coordination, and that's the hard part. The easy part is who in the neighborhood wants to buy into this system, and that'll be based upon availability of shares, which are entirely the result of the size of the project. So it goes back to the need for diversity. It's not cookie cutter. It's based on specific parameters in specific buildings whose occupants and owners have responded to this message. And the share buyers that participate financially are essentially the third step in enrollment. And the number of investors will depend on basically what amount of equity the users and owners are opening up to investment.
Okay,
So-
yeah, that all makes sense. I'll stay out of the weeds for now. But yeah, I will, eventually there'll be more clarity as to what happens, let's say, when a resident in a multi-family building or an apartment building leaves town, their share becomes available, somebody else wants to purchase a share. Is that bought at par value? Is the equity taken into consideration? All those questions that I still have, but I appreciate your clarification to this point.
So other questions? It would be really helpful for those who haven't been. CJ.
Yes, thank you so much for this presentation. That's Rebecca and Paul. It's a really fascinating topic. Being a land use planner first and foremost, I'm trying to understand a little bit about how you foresee the different renewable technologies and what scale. If I think if I'm hearing you correctly, this could be a variety of renewable generation technologies at both a, say, smaller parcel, urban parcel scale, as well as perhaps more, quote, utility scale. And when I mean utility scale, like large scale, the community solar maybe size, or community, wind 5 megawatts or 5 to 20 megawatt size. And just conceptually trying to understand how a program can address all those different scales and how it works with this, and then what we can do as planners to help.
Should I take that, Rebecca, or you want to take it? Or okay, I'll give my.
I'm taking notes, so if you don't
Okay,
mind taking
alright,
this, that'd be great.
Yeah, so there are, CJ, there are essentially, I guess, two categories. One category, which is really the emphasis of this program, because it's focused on decarbonization, is on the building level. And that's where the generation and the load are physically connected on the same site. And so it's not seeking to export back onto the grid, it's seeking to self-consume on the site. And that's where you get your biggest carbon impact per dollar, per watt. And so that is the strategic focus, is getting that to happen, because that's really the main part of the market that has never been penetrated at scale effectively. I mean, except in very few places, but typically is underexploited. That is the urban core, right? But also most homes, most businesses, whereas the market tends to gravitate out into green fields. And the reason is that the transaction costs are higher, and that the system is really set up for that arrangement, right? The utilities prefer it because they get revenue from transmission. And so the whole regulatory paradigm has been sort of pushed things out into the suburbs, just like development, right? This is where there's preference for greenfield. And so we anticipate that there will be brownfield systems that are grid connected. And there may be some greenfield systems that come into play. Those have to basically feed through the grid like any other system. They have to basically feed through the energy service provider to the CCA. So they effectively, that would be a sort of conventional part of the program. But it's really not the core goal really of this program, which is to break into behind the meter systems that are eliminating grid load and natural gas load. And so when I say the systems, they're not just generation systems, they're also appliance retrofits, they're building envelope retrofits and efficiency measures. So it's really a deep retrofit approach to buildings that really fits into the city's decarbonization program, building decarbonization programs. Very partly why I think we got hooked up, was that it's very aligned to that kind of paradigm. But yeah, there may be some greenfield elements to this, but we're trying to minimize it, and just because that's become a problem, right? I mean, that's become a big conflict area where farms are getting converted, to essentially industrial uses, and it's causing a lot of opposition to renewable energy. And it's just the missed opportunity in these markets, just like redevelopment's a missed opportunity, that the urban cores are left to rot, and then the farms all get destroyed, and it's because of essentially a dysfunctional market that that continues to cause a lot of damage. In effect, when if the transaction costs can be addressed, which the approach we're taking is really designed to do, then the added marginal costs of developing systems in buildings can be reduced. The marketing costs can be reduced. Those are very significant percentage of the cost of installed systems, like half, right? In the photovoltaic arena, half of the cost of your installed system is customer acquisition. Half of the cost of your system was to find you, and which is retarded. And so, we're trying to rationalize those processes in this program, use the aggregation, just the same way aggregation lowered the cost of supply and broke a lot of the assumed economic rules of the market, namely that green power is more expensive than brown power. That was an unquestioned rule until about 15 years ago. And it was mostly CCA that broke it, because aggregations enabled CCAs that were greener and cheaper. And before that, that didn't happen.
So Paul, let me stop you there, because I think you've answered the question. And
Okay.
I'll see if there's other questions. Now, the town has had, Rebecca.
Sorry, I just wanted to add one thing to CJ's question. I think one of the benefits of this program is, to your question about utility scale or, larger than just a couple of buildings, is that this would provide a pathway for, say, the municipalities to co-invest in, say, large-scale battery storage. That it's a different relationship, I think, than, say, a group of neighbors or something like that. And I think that allows for the scale to be bigger. But just wanted to add that as well, that this would provide the financial structure, I guess, to enable that.
So the town has had a couple of opportunities. Oh, good. Cynthia has a question. Cynthia, you need a different picture. It's summer.
Yeah, sorry about that. That's a holdover from a while ago, apparently. Thank you for all the work on this, and thank you for Rebecca for bringing in the answer to the question that I'd raised at the PEDC meeting, having to do with energy coming into this grid as well as coming out of the grid. I think you used the traffic analogy, so thank you for that. And I also appreciate your mentioning that battery storage can open up the zones that can participate. As you all know, I'm from Hawaii. My island is actually Maui, so I'm paying a lot of attention to what is happening in communities. It's a tropical island, and the island is on fire. And I am reminded of the importance of creating resiliency in the system. It was mentioned that the system is not talking about distribution, that you are basically talking about production and purchasing processes and ownership processes. But as we see on Maui, the distribution system of energy is equally important if we want to be resilient. Many decisions were made over the years to not put our distribution system underground. And that makes us exposed, obviously, to fires and droughts. I'm recalling recent discussions on the county level having to do with the fact that much of the undeveloped land in Tompkins County has been planted with red pine as a monocrop in 1930. Red pine has a very shallow root structure, very obviously it burns very hot and fast during a drought. So as we look to Canada, as we look to Maui, as we look to other cities that are facing drought and the risk of fire, are we going to at some point include a conversation about making our electrical distribution systems more resilient? I know it's not part of the conversation at this point, but I think it needs to be in terms of a long-term holistic view of how do we support our community.
I may be able to just comment on that. I know there wasn't really a question in there. I think we can remain flexible in terms of where this goes in the future. I don't think that anything is out of the question at this point, but we would need to have the capital in order to purchase that infrastructure. The other thing that's important to remember is that we need to get off of gas before we can start undergrounding our electrical utilities if we want to save a boatload. Your dog is so cute. If we want to save a boatload of money, because we can actually utilize that infrastructure, and then the utility will actually have to pay for it. So when we are no longer using natural gas, it is the utility's responsibility to decommission that infrastructure, and they have to pay for it. When we do that, that's a really, really good time to start undergrounding our electrical lines. But I think if we start trying to do step 2 before doing step 1, it causes a lot of unnecessary costs. So as we have neighbors, for example, investing in these, say, heat pumps or otherwise electrifying thermal loads, that is the time to start having the questions of, okay, can we start decommissioning this neighborhood? And then what's the next step? But I don't think we're close to the point of having a conversation at the whole city scale. Not yet, anyway, but I hope to be there.
And I do know that you're right, Cynthia, this is somewhat broader than obviously what we're focused on right now, but I do know that Terry Carroll and others are having conversations to try to figure out this broader resiliency issue. So I think I've sort of lost track, but I do know that those discussions are happening. And it's fun to see you travel and a dog and all that kind of stuff. So good, okay.
Just very quickly, I mean, I don't know if it's something where when the city or town is looking at putting in and replacing water and sewer pipes and so on and dealing with I&I, is this something that can be folded into that project as well? Just to put that out as an aside.
Noted. Yeah, you're taking us in directions we weren't ready to go in yet, but that's good. That's good. So other questions from the city? And Bill, this is kind of newer stuff for you. I mean, so I'm hoping you might have a question in part to help us figure out, oh, we've missed that. We need to dig more deeply into some issue. And even though I had said to my CC colleagues, we'll wait for you to ask questions at the end, you can ask questions now too. So if any of our CCE colleagues have any questions, please just raise your hand. Guillermo. And Guillermo, some people might not know who you are, so if you can just introduce yourself.
Yeah, hi. Thanks. Guillermo Metz with Cooperative Extension. I run what's called the Energy and Climate Change team. So we run a variety of programs that help residents and municipal officials understand their energy use, and programs that allow them to reduce energy use and convert off of fossil fuels, essentially, at Extension in Tompkins County. And we run programs throughout the southern tier and even more broadly. But a very specific question to the investment side, is there thought at this point in how to make it available to everyone? Rebecca, you talked about it being accessible to everyone at every level, renters, etc. No credit check, it sounds like, and no minimum investment. Is that the idea?
That is, yes, that is the idea. Obviously we have to pre-qualify and enroll banks and define the terms that are going to work for them with co-ops. But part of the idea is to use a shares vehicle to open up investment, so and that's the emphasis on users, DER users, and site owners to provide the project, the platform for the project, but to define it as open to the neighborhood, and to have active enrollment of people in the neighborhood in those projects. But it does depend upon consent of parties. It is a voluntary activity, consent of the owner, consent of the users, and consent of the lender. So there's work still to be done on facilitating that, and specifically on establishing security for the parties, an adequate security for the lender. But that's partly the concept here, is that you, instead of just exposing or requiring the lender to deal with sub 670s credit score borrowers, to essentially bundle together creditworthy borrowers with non-creditworthy borrowers into co-ops, right? So that there is a structure to that relationship, and then to work out the security factors in the cooperative agreements between them in a way that's sensitive to their situation rather than cookie cutter. So it's at this point an art, not a science, but the structure though is intended to be more robust than what the market gives you, which is just individual exposure to credit conditions, and therefore de facto redlining of the vast majority of consumers.
Guillermo, do you have a follow-up question, or did that?
Well, no, that's very helpful. I think that there is a lot to be figured out in the details, and I would want to see, I guess, I'm a little concerned about the timeline that it would take for a project to be identified, a developer to be identified, the founders or institutions that can fund the project to be identified, and then investors to be identified, and then the project actually built, etc. So I think I would want to be realistic with off-takers on what the expected timeline of something like that could be. And obviously it depends on whether it's solar or geothermal or whatever, but I expect that they would be quite long.
Yeah, I mean, it would be, I guess, the comparison of the site acquisition process and the development process versus the interconnect queue.
Yeah,
Right.
that's true.
And so we're just like, we'll have a new set of problems through this strategy, and clearly, but it won't have that problem.
Right.
So, and it partly will, I think, offer relief to that problem, and just open up a new pathway to renewables development that isn't there right now. So it's, but yeah, no, it's a lot of work in the process. You know, there are obviously there are that's why we want to use this template process. So not to be over standardized, but to work towards standardization. And hopefully that will speed up the enrollment processes. And obviously we'll have to develop like I said, adequate terms for the lenders to participate. And that's going to be a whole discussion. But it's a 2030 strategy. It's not looking to complete the whole thing in 1 or 2 years. It's 6 or 7 years out, but it's trying to set up a robust process with good principles, so that we've got a solid basis to work out those problems, and hopefully that by doing it, speed up the process.
That's great. Thank you.
So I put Bill Goodman on the spot and he left. So I'll see if Dexon or Deb have any questions, and see if that means they leave too. Dexon or Deb, do you have any questions?
No, I'm good. I've been in a few iterations of this presentation and I have direct access to Rebecca anytime I need, so I'm set, but thank you.
Dexon? He's also good, he says in the chat. Anyone else have questions? Rich, did you want to circle back around to anything?
No, that
Okay.
would only prolong the meeting for everyone else. I imagine we'll be meeting going forward. If we get into any specifics, I'll hold off until those meetings.
one last chance for any questions. If you think of things afterwards, just email me, Rich, Rebecca, whoever you know, just email us questions and the CCA team meets, we still call it, I guess we call it the TGen team, meets every other week. So we meet on a regular basis. So feel free to ask us additional questions. We will be starting to think about education and outreach abroad, the broader CCA picture fairly soon, but this was important since both the city and the town will be presumably voting on the DER plan in September. So any final questions? So Rebecca and Paul, thank you very much
Thank you.
for your presentation. And I think it's a beautiful evening. So go out and enjoy the evening.
Okay.
Take care.
All right.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.
You.
See you later.
Bye-bye.